I want to remind everybody again that this episode and the last episode of Adam Walks Around were filmed during the pandemic when we were unable to access haircuts or hair salons. So even more than usual, what you see is what you get. That's interesting. What am I looking at? Those goats or sacks of cement? Okay. Hey, whoa. Holy crap. Okay. It's different. Hi, guys. Yeah. I got nothing. Welcome back. Welcome to the Mojave Desert. And for the next couple of days, I'm going to be taking you around and showing you a little bit about how auto travel evolved in the United States and how many of these forgotten pathways still exist if you know where to find them. This little bike path here actually was once one of the main auto roads to Los Angeles. And to explain how we got from something like this to the 4-lane and 6-lane and 8-lane superhighways that cross our country now, I have to go back and explain how things evolved when people first started putting the pedal to the metal. Now this is a great spot to visually show you how things evolved here in the United States. Now this is State Highway 14. The freeway part of this was built in the 70s, if I recall correctly. Before that, it was just 2 lanes. And before that, when it was 2 lanes, it was US Route 6. Before that, we had auto trails. And right next to the modern highway is a later version of the Midland Trail. This was built around 1922. So if you were going into Los Angeles and you were here in the 20s, this was your jam. Now to help you visualize the transition from dirt roads to interstates, let's take a short pit stop at Red Rock Canyon State Park. Now the history of the Midland Trail through Red Rock Canyon is a good example of how things evolved. The original alignment was way up in those mountains near the California Aqueduct. The road was put through about the same time, so it made sense to mark the trail that was already there near the aqueduct. It was about the only thing that was out here then. In the 20s, that dirt road you saw earlier was put through this canyon right about where I'm standing now. And then probably about 1933 or so, it turned into this paved road and was later designated as US Route 6. It was probably widened in the 40s or 50s to this width. It's obviously been paved over since then, but this is roughly what your ride would have looked like in the 50s if you were pulling into LA. So how did all this auto trail business get started? How did the very first people that crossed this desert, which was even more barren then than it is now, how did they do it? Now, this is a good example of what you might have found if you were a pioneer auto traveler trying to get across the desert at the first part of the last century. Where there were signs, it was pretty much whatever the locals decided to put up to help you out. In those days, the government wasn't as involved in road building as they are now. In fact, they weren't even sure it was something that they wanted to do. The first roads in this country were built by private entrepreneurs who charged tolls to make back the money that they put into grading and flattening the road beds. Later on, when people saw the possibilities of advancement for their communities that auto travel and tourism would bring, local village fathers and citizens would do like a early 20th century version of GoFundMe. to raise money to grade the roads, make better alignments, even do some primitive paving. Now, traveling in those early days through this barren landscape took guts. Up there, Robber's Roost. That's where bandits hung out to wait for the stagecoaches to go by in the valley. Later on, you had to deal with primitive roads and the primitive cars. Early Model Ts were basically built to be disassembled and repaired on the fly. And it wasn't uncommon for people to actually have to do just that out here, where amenities were few and far between. Now, if you were one of those early auto travelers and you needed something, what was here for you? Not much. Pretty much you had to rely on the infrastructure that was left over from the stagecoach days, and because there weren't a lot of cars going through here in the early part of the last century, there was quite a bit of overlap. Now, that flat area right behind me, that was the site of Freeman Stage Station. This actually was a major intersection in the 19th century. There was a stagecoach road that went up over the mountains through Walker Pass, and the early Midland Trail, and before that, the stagecoach road that went through here was behind me. This place stayed open from the 1870s till about 1920, at which point the new Freeman Junction opened up where the new Midland Trail was, a couple miles that way. Figuring out the paths of stagecoach roads and early auto trails can take a lot of detective work. Going through old maps, correlating them to modern day landmarks, and a lot of good old walking around. It can be hard to know which road is just someone's driveway or going to someone's old mining claim, and which was a 100-year-old superhighway. You see, this is the original path of the road going straight ahead. You can just make out the trace going up and over down to Freeman Stage Station. Now, the Midland Trail was first signposted in 1913, but was that the first road through here? Actually, it was not. And let's take a short walk over here where you can see another set of tracks. Pioneer road builder Remy Nadeau built this road from Los Angeles to the mines at Cerro Gordo in the 1870s. This road became the basis for the first alignment of the Midland Trail, and later on, they improved it. Now, Remy Nadeau's first stagecoach trail had a nickname, the Shotgun Road. You can see why. Now, what's cool about these old auto trails is there's a pretty high awareness of the old federal highways, especially Route 66. So the leftover roadside attractions, ruins, things like that, those have pretty well been picked over. But would you have known this road had any significance? Most people don't. So you can find some pretty cool stuff on the side of the road. You never know what you're going to find if you keep your eyes peeled. A place with this many discarded cans was probably an old campground. Look at this. Look at the old nails and the material. This old building is the last remnant of Little Lake, a watering hole along the old Midland Trail. There was a large hotel that stood over there until about 20 years ago when it burnt down. You can see here how the old road used to hug the shores of Little Lake before it was cut off by the newer road. Must have been a beautiful drive, and it offers a beautiful view of the mysterious Sierras in the distance. So today's modern day freeway started out as Remy Nadeau's Stagecoach Road, then was upgraded slightly to the Midland Trail, then became Old US Highway 6. But what about the most famous federal highway? Route 66. Was there an earlier version of that too? Yes, there is. That's what we're going to see tomorrow. The two-lane blacktop known as Route 66 has captured the imagination of the entire world. I can vouch for the fact that even in the most remote parts of Southeast Asia I've visited, I've seen Route 66 memorabilia everywhere. The stretch that runs through the California desert is one of the best preserved parts of the old road, and thousands of people drive it every year. But most people don't even realize that this was built in 1933. But Route 66 dates back to 1926. So where was the road before this? Very few people realize that here in California, on the most famous stretch of Route 66 in the whole country, we're not even driving on the original alignment. What's more, most of the original alignment of the road is still here, and a lot of it is still drivable. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the first Route 66 and the last alignment of the National Old Trails Road. Auto Trail that came here and paved the way for the most famous road in the world. Just like we saw yesterday with the Midland Trail, before Route 66 was designated in 1926 and signed in this area by the Auto Club in 1928, there was a named auto trail called the National Old Trails Highway. It was first signposted in 1913 as the rather long-winded Grand Canyon Santa Fe Needles Highway before being renamed in 1914 as the National Old Trails Road. Throughout the California desert, there is 1, 2, even 3 separate pathways for this old road that exist independently of the two-lane Route 66 most tourists drive on today. To make things even more confusing, the Route 66 tourists drive on today is signposted as National Trails Highway. But for the most part, the National Old Trails Road that's named after followed a completely separate path. So when the first people came to signpost the most famous route in the world in 1928, this was the road that they put the signs on. You won't find it listed in many, if any, guidebooks, but it's here. Finding these old auto trails can lead you to mysterious remnants and artifacts like this abandoned chicken farm outside of Daggett. Things tend to stay where they're at in the desert, and there are a few vestiges of the pre-1966 era of the National Old Trails Road. The earliest automobile pioneers on the National Old Trails Road, which ran just to the left, would come to the Daggett garage to get their major repairs done. Dating back from the 1880s, this building was moved here and was still functioning as a garage 100 years later. Can you ask me that question again?
Would you play tennis when it's this hot?
I wouldn't. My parents probably would have. Wow, actual interaction. Who would have thought? Now, in the old days, the only thing that crossed this desert was the railroad. And if you wanted to try getting across here by car, your only option was to try taking the sandy path that the railroad workers had used to lay the ties. And it wasn't even as good as that was, so good luck. Now this little road peeling off from Route 66 is actually a preserved remnant of the 1914 version of the National Old Trails Road. Very similar to the view people would have seen if they were driving across the California desert more than 100 years ago. It's 1914, just you and a Model T and this road. In the old days, the original road went straight here, but we'll be hanging a right and picking that up a little bit later. Well, here's the old road again, going to these people's driveway, and we're going to meet up with it down there. Here you can see the path of the old road coming back into the road we're on. The Route 66 that we know and love is way over there. And this is the route of the National Old Trails Road. This is how you got your kicks before there was a Route 66. Now for this stretch, you better have four-wheel drive. But believe it or not, you can tell from a few spots of blacktop that are still here This was once paved and probably was, once again, the very first alignment of Route 66. Now the original road continued across and over to the other side of the freeway, but for us it's time to take one big bump and back on to our favorite Route 66. Finding this stretch of weathered blacktop about 24 years ago was what first put me hip to the idea that there was an earlier version of Route 66. Little did I know in that pre-internet time that there were a lot of other road scholars just like me making the same realization. As you can see, this old road is now marked as a Jeep trail, but that's a recent development. No guidebooks, no histories of the road talked about the earlier alignment of Route 66, and there was very little talked about the mysterious pre-Route 66 road, the National Old Trails Highway, or the Old Trails Road. That has begun to change. And it's great because it's a little mystery behind the big mystery of the most famous road in the world. And if you have four-wheel drive and high enough ground clearance, you can drive this or some earlier alignment of National Old Trails Road pretty much all the way across the desert. In fact, the earliest road in 1913 went through those mountains on the other side of the railroad, but if you try to drive it now, you'll end up in an ordnance range, so I don't recommend it. Here's another one of these things. So not stagecoach era, but still don't know what it is. Now, when the road was first signposted in 1913 and in 1914, who did it? Well, it wasn't the government. It wasn't a government road. It actually was a creation of business boosters from all around the country and the Automobile Club, which at that time was called the Auto Club of Southern California. And when they put up signs, they put them up on poles like these, rolled up pieces of metal, screw right here. At one point, this sign said, National Trails Road. Now we find ourselves at Ludlow. The time is 5:17. Now if you're driving east on I-40, Ludlow is your last stop before you hit miles and miles of nothing, which kind of makes a good idea for a song, but we'll get to that later. Ludlow is also the jumping off point for the longest contiguous stretch of preserved old Route 66 in the country. And as you might expect, it also offers a lot of avenues to explore the original Route 66 and previous alignments of the National Old Trails Road. There's not much going on in Ludlow now, but back around the turn of the last century, it was a really big railroad town. The National Old Trails Road went right here. This was the main drag. This whole stretch was filled with businesses, hotels, cafes, stores. The only one of those that's left is the remains of the old Murphy Mercantile Building, which was intact up until fairly recently, but unfortunately the front of which fell down in an earthquake. The area between Ludlow and Amboy contains no fewer than 4 pre-66 alignments of the National Old Trails Highway and the Grand Canyon Santa Fe Needles Highway. This spot coming out of Ludlow on the eastbound track gives you a feel for the development of the roads in this region. Interstate 40 was put through in the mid-70s. Before that, US 66 was the main drag. This alignment was built in the early 30s. Prior to that, Route 66 was signposted on the last alignment of the National Old Trails Road, which dates from the early 20s. Prior to that, the National Old Trails Road ran on a dirt track scraped out of the gravel between US 66 and I-40. And if that wasn't complicated enough, even prior to that, there was an early alignment on the south side of the railroad, just on the other side of the tracks. There are so many fascinating old roads in this region, it would take a week or even a year to explore them all. But can you see, way off in the distance, that little track on the other side of the railroad? That is one of the most intriguing alignments of the National Old Trails Road. Built in the mid-teens and only in use for about 5 or 7 years, it tracked its own unique alignment through the lonely mountains in this region. following a path not seen before or since. And if you have the nerve and a good four-wheel rig, it's still passable. Barely. And if all that wasn't enough to contemplate, what's this primitive track that was scraped out of the desert that plays tag with the various alignments in this region that nobody seems to know anything about? Best guess, based on one reference in an old map, is that it was built by the telephone crews who first put the poles through this region. Yet another mystery in a desert that is full of them. You may not believe there were so many people traveling through this inhospitable area that early in our history until you come across the remnants of an old campground. Now we're back on a better improved section of Route 66 Mach 1. Just like its later counterpart, the original Route 66 National Old Trails Highway had little towns that sprung up to service the pioneer travelers coming across the vast desert. Now, when I first came across this spot called Siberia 20 odd years ago, there were nearly intact buildings there, or at least the walls were there. Fortunately, I took a high-res photo. You can see that photo and see what it looked like here. Now, any Route 66 aficionado worth his or her salt knows about the movie Baghdad Cafe. And you'll also know that it was filmed at a cafe about 50 miles from here at a place called Newberry Springs, which we, in classic Adam Walks Around style, bypassed because we were looking at another road. You may not have known that there really was a Baghdad Cafe that inspired the movie, and it was right here. In fact, the entire town of Baghdad was here, serving travelers on the new Route 66 and the older Route 66, which crisscrossed right through here, until the buildings were raised about 1974, reportedly because they were having a hippie squatter problem. The only thing marking Baghdad now is that tree and a movie that was made in a different place. But speaking of intriguing places in the desert, remember earlier I showed you that mysterious road going off into the wilds? Well, we're going to try and get there before the sun goes down and show you one of the most intriguing parts of that road. Oh, man. So that one mysterious alignment I told you about that went off in the middle of nowhere? Well, I almost couldn't find it myself. Look how far out we are. And I actually was just about to give up, and then I turned around and there it was. When they built this road, it wasn't a big road building exercise. It was mostly putting up signs on tracks and paths that were already there, and later on they improved it. But on this section, which as I said was only in use for a few years, they actually did elaborate rock work and cuts into the side of the hill in this section of the desert called Dish Hill. Despite that, this road was only in use from around 1915 to around 1920 before they put the road back down where the railroad is and where it is today. Guess even then, this was too remote. You can see how much time and effort went into carving this little path out of the side of the hill with grading and rocks built up to support the roadbed. The standards of the National Old Trails Road of the 19-teens, this was a superhighway. Obviously, it's been a long time since this stretch of the National Old Trails Road has been passable. But further down, and on the other side of that mountain range, there's even more elaborate road work on a roadbed that's still passable to someone who's determined and has four-wheel drive. With daylight fading, our tour ends just down the road in Amboy. which served pioneer travelers on the Old Trails Road just as it later did on Route 66. Most of the buildings from that earlier Old Trails time are gone, but on a dusky and empty pandemic day, just as we peer uneasily into the future, the relics of the Route 66 era give us a vivid and spooky glimpse into a long-vanished time and remind us how much we take for granted will inevitably pass into history.
Let me tell you, brother, something you don't know. This was the mother of the mother road. And to Baltimore and back, people drove over this dirt track. And in 1926 became the first Route 66.